May 1945. One of the things Stalin and the Soviets are infamous for in World War II is the Not a Step Back command, or Order number 227 of the People's Commissar for Defense of 28th of July 1942. This was the order that anyone fleeing the enemy would be shot for cowardice. It cost over 150,000 Soviet soldiers their lives. Less known is that when it looks all but certain that Germany will lose the war, the Nazis do pretty much exactly the same thing. Moreover, in the process of killing their own for what they call cowardice, many Nazi leaders and military officers flee from the enemy like rats, leaving the sinking Reich. I'm Spartacus Olsson. This is War Against Humanity, a series of World War II in real time. At first glance, the idea of fighting to the death when faced with the awesome opposition that Germany is in early 1945 looks insane. But there's method to the madness. What the Nazis fear more than defeat by the enemy at this point is a repeat of 1918, a socialist-driven rising against the government. They believe that a shameful capitulation will lead to their regime's destruction, not in a glorious fight to death against the forces of their imaginary enemy, the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy, but by the furious masses of its own people. So they need to buy time to make sure that this rising does not happen. They will prevent the rising by murdering anyone that could organize it. And to gain time, they will murder anyone looking to do the only sensible thing you can if you are German at this point: surrender. Another parallel to 1918 they fear is losing control over the armed forces. If morale and Nazi fervor is not enough to keep the men of the Wehrmacht loyal and fighting to the end, a firing squad or the hangman's rope will have to do the job. And as 1945 begins, that looks ever more likely to be their method of choice. In January, Wehrmacht morale plummets after the failure of the German Ardennes offensive in the west and the success of the Soviet Wisła-Oder offensive in the east. On January 26, an SS staff officer of the propaganda department of Army Group Upper Rhine reports that the mood among the fighting troops has become more nervous and serious by the day on account of the events on the Eastern Front. If the situation gets worse in the next days, it can be reckoned that the fighting spirit of the troops will be paralyzed by worries that can no longer be borne. Similar reports are coming in from the Eastern Front as desertion, looting, and shirking become ever more a problem. In some cases, entire Volkssturm units are throwing down their weapons and surrendering. Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler responds in a typically bloodthirsty fashion. At the end of January, he declares that the German people must show no sympathy to shirkers, cowards, and weaklings. Men who take themselves from the front line are not deserving of bread from their homeland. He also praises the commander of Festung Schneidemühl in Pomerania for shooting retreating soldiers and hanging them from trees. Then, in mid-February, he tells higher SS and police leaders in the West that they are to use maximum severity to round up all stragglers and to shoot looters and deserters on the spot. These harsh measures certainly don't deal with the underlying problem. At the end of 1944, the number of troops avoiding service in the Reich stood at about 250,000, but by the end of February 1945, Martin Bormann estimates that this has risen to 600,000. As you will know from Indy's coverage of the war, this doesn't lead to a total collapse of the German forces, though. Sure, there are some large-scale surrenders like in the Ruhr, but for the most part, the army fights until the end. When issuing his murderous orders, Himmler is not just driving the policy himself, but is allowing himself to be led by the radicals below him. It's a classic example of how policymaking works in the Nazi state, and something that remains quite consistent even at this late stage of the war. One of the men driving things from below is Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner, a true Nazi believer and perhaps the most fanatical of all Hitler's field marshals. While in command of Army Group North last year, he opened his meetings in the wake of the failed Stauffenburg bomb plot by asking his officers, "How many men did you hang today?" Now in command of Army Group Center, Schöne's methods only become harsher as the situation deteriorates. On March 8th, Hitler authorizes the use of fliegende Sonderstandgericht, or flying courts-martials. Schöne is the most enthusiastic adopter of these new kangaroo courts, and he takes the flying element quite literally. A new phrase soon spreads amongst his troops. Der Pferdel kommt, oder Here comes the Pferd. Soon enough, the Pferd himself will drop down in his little Fiesler Storch liaison aircraft, hand out a handful of death sentences, and then fly on to the next unfortunate set of men. His methods earn the praise of Joseph Goebbels, who describes them in a diary entry of March 9th. He takes special aim at the so-called regular stragglers. By regular stragglers, he means those soldiers who always seem to understand how to remove themselves from their unit in critical situations and vanish back into the rear under some kind of pretext. He deals with such figures quite brutally, has them hanged from the nearest tree wearing a placard that says, "I am a deserter and was too cowardly to protect German women and children." By the end of the war, 30,000 German soldiers will have been sentenced to death at court-martials, with about 20,000 of those sentences carried out. In contrast, the British will have executed 40, the French 103, and the Americans 146. The numbers on the Soviet side are, of course, far higher, with estimates ranging up to 158,000 troops shot. The Nazis soon extend the same deadly methods from the military to the civilian sphere as they lose control on the Western Front. In the opening months of 1945, the party's authority diminishes rapidly as those living on the front lines lose any remaining faith in Hitler's ability to protect them. They realize beyond doubt that their Führer has led them to damnation, and that occupation by the Western Allies is much preferable to a pointless fight to the death. With most of the men either away at the front, working in the war industry, or dragooned into the Volkssturm, it often falls to women to try and prevent further bloodshed. One such case occurs in Ochsenfurt in Würzburg on March 29th, where a group of women begin dismantling the tank traps and barricades at entrances to the city. The authorities arrest 3 women and sentence them to death on April 1st. Fortunately, the Americans arrive before the sentences can be carried out. Orders from Berlin leave no doubt for local Nazi leadership and reinforce these harsh judgments. On April 3rd, Heinrich Himmler orders that in any house in which the white flag appears, all males are to be shot. Many of the regional and county leaders, the Gauleiter and Kreisleiter, follow these orders to the letter. On April 6, a Kreisleiter named Richard Draus is driving down a street in suburban Heilbronn. Seeing white flags hanging from several houses, he stops his car and furiously orders his men, "Get out! Shoot! Shoot! Shoot everybody!" Draus's thugs murder 4 civilians, including a pastor. Goebbels himself, as the Gauleiter of Berlin, takes similarly brutal steps to maintain order when in early April 200 people storm a bakery. These people aren't trying to overthrow the state. They're simply hungry and desperate. But Goebbels declares that this disorder is a symptom of inner weakness and budding defeatism. He singles out a man and a woman as supposed ringleaders, throws them to the People's Court, and sees them beheaded the following evening. The executions are announced via radio and posters. Nazi violence by this point is completely indiscriminate. In Bad Windsheim, west of Nuremberg, about 200 or 300 women assemble themselves in the marketplace on April 12th and beg the mayor and the local army commander to surrender the city to the approaching Americans. The army commander refuses to do so, but does not retaliate against the women. Nonetheless, an SS Untersturmführer arrives in town the next day to dispense justice. Acting on false reports, he tracks down one of the supposed ringleaders, an innocent woman named Christine Schmotzer, accosts her in front of her house, pulls out his sidearm and shoots her in front of her husband and daughter. A placard placed next to her body reads, "A traitor has been executed." In total, there are some 10,000 people summarily executed in this final phase of terror, a number dwarfed by the hundreds of thousands the Nazis murder for being perceived as the racial, political, and ideological enemies of Nazism in these months. The blood rage they are pursuing is driven by a fanatical desire to complete their genocidal mission to eradicate Judeo-Bolshevism and a paranoid attempt to preempt revolution. Now, I have covered the death marches, the final murder sprees, and deaths from disease that continue right up to the liberation of the camps by Allied forces in recent videos. On top of the camp inmates and chattel slaves in the slave factories, there are millions of foreign forced laborers in Germany at varying degrees of enslavement. They will now feel some of the worst of the end-stage violence tied to the Nazi end vision. The precise number of foreign forced laborers in Germany is somewhat unclear. In summer 1944, the Germans themselves record at least 7.6 million foreign civilians and POW on German territory. But numbers have risen since then, and there are different ways of counting and categorizing these laborers. At the end of the war, at least 10, perhaps even 12 million people, including POWs, will be recorded as freed from Nazi labor service. The most numerous are the Ostarbeiter, the forced laborers from Poland and the Soviet Union. Over the past year, they have become a far more visible presence on the streets of German towns and cities, especially since Allied bombing intensified at the end of 1944. Sitting at the bottom of the Nazi racial hierarchy, the Ostarbeiter are the last in line for rations and the last to have their homes rebuilt after raids, if that rebuilding even happens at all. Left without food, work, or housing, hundreds of thousands of them have essentially become displaced persons. Some retreat to the countryside where German farmers employ them off the books, but many end up sheltering in Germany's shattered cities. Some set up home and air raid shelters, stations, bombed out buildings, and public parks, keep their heads down and wait for the end of the war. Those who can scratch out a living by selling trinkets made of scrap materials or by begging. But some Ostarbeiter descend into the criminal underworld and form gangs with German criminals, deserters, and dissidents. They contribute to the wave of looting, black marketeering, and robbery that sweeps Germany in the final year of the war. The situation is particularly serious in Cologne, which was hit extremely hard by Allied bombers in the closing months of 1944. Soon there are some 30,000 foreign workers left to fend for themselves in the ruins of the city. As the Western Front approaches, Cologne becomes the center for organized crime in the Rhine-Ruhr region. Now, these criminals aren't looking to topple the Nazi state. In fact, they have no political objectives whatsoever. Sure, they do interact with the Edelweiss pirates and other dissidents who have gone to ground. But this is simply the case of two persecuted groups having parallel objectives. In fact, the surviving underground communist and socialist movements mostly shun foreign workers for their lack of political desire. Despite this, the authorities are convinced that these criminal gangs are part of a communist plot against the state. As of February 1945, the chief of the Reich Security Main Office, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, authorizes local police chiefs to conduct summary executions of foreign workers. Shootings and hangings become commonplace across the Reich. I will list just a few cases here. In Cologne, the security services execute 74 foreign workers on February 27th and hang another 50 in Gestapo headquarters in March. In Duisburg, 24 are shot in February and 67 suspected foreign and German gangsters are shot in March. In Oberhausen, in April, a mob of civilians beats to death an Ostarbeiter for stealing potatoes. Many foreign workers also fall victim as the German police clear out a prison system that has swelled to at least 190,000 inmates. As well as political opponents and foreign workers, the cells are also filled with ordinary Germans imprisoned during the crackdown on looting, theft, and the undermining of morale. In Kiel, 200 prisoners are executed by the end of April. In Dortmund, the police and Gestapo kill some 240 men and women in March and April, and the murders continue even as Allied troops enter the outskirts of the city. Knowing that the end is coming, the regime takes its final revenge on the German resistance. Hitler's opponents cannot be allowed to witness the downfall of Nazism. At some point in early April, Hitler orders the liquidation of all remaining prisoners involved in the various plots against him over the years. Among their number is Georg Elsa, the carpenter who set a time bomb to blow Hitler up at a Munich beer hall in November 1939. In the end, Hitler left the beer hall early, and since 1941, Elsa has been held without trial in Sachsenhausen and then Dachau. On April 9th, he is shot. Chief among the victims are the men of the Abwehr resistance group who were connected to the various elements of conservative Catholic and military resistance. The arrests of these men began in 1943 and accelerated after the Stauffenberg bomb plot in 1944. Their names will be familiar from our coverage at the time. On April 8th or 9th, Hans von Donani is executed at Sachsenhausen. He had operated an escape route for Jews and had smuggled explosives for Generalmajor Henning von Treskov's March 1943 attempt on Hitler's life. Hans Oster, former deputy chief of the Abwehr, procured those explosives from captured British devices. He is hanged on April 9th at Flossenburg concentration camp. So too is the Lutheran pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who has acted as a messenger between the Western Allies and the German resistance. Their former boss, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, is also executed. Hitler also orders the execution of somewhere in the region of 150 to 160 high-profile prisoners held in Dachau. These include about 40 family members of Klaus Stauffenberg, Karl Goerdeler and other bomb plot conspirators, former chief of the Army General Staff Franz Halder and his wife, British, Polish and Danish spies and POWs, and a dozen of Austrian, French, Hungarian, Italian, Soviet and Greek politicians and generals. But in the final weeks of April, they are transported by road to South Tyrol for execution and disposal. In extraordinary circumstances, their lives are saved on April 30th when a group of Wehrmacht soldiers stage an armed standoff against the SS and then hand the prisoners over to American troops. Those lives were saved because a group of German soldiers said no to further bloodshed. Whether it was motivated by plain moral courage, an eye on post-war self-preservation, or some combination of both, they put themselves on their line against their fellow countrymen. The SS would no doubt have executed them too if things had gone differently. On the whole, though, moral courage is in short supply in the final days of the Third Reich, and the hypocrisy at the root of the Nazi system is revealed in its totality as Nazis escape their reckoning. Other than Hitler, Goebbels, Himmler, and the other top Nazis, none embodied this more than the Gauleiter and Kreisleiter. As Martin Bormann stated on April 1st, their orders are to stay at their post and lead their people in a fight to the death. Any scumbag who leaves his Gau when under attack without express order of the Führer, anyone not fighting to the last breath, will be proscribed and treated as a deserter. Raise your hearts and overcome all weakness. Now there is only one slogan: conquer or fall. Long live Germany. Long live Adolf Hitler. As we have seen, the Gau and Kreisleiter are perfectly happy to murder their own people in service of this perverted Nazi idea of bravery. But when it comes down to the wire, they're not too keen on fighting to the last breath themselves. Neither do they try to save their people. Instead, they flee like rats. Already in March, Josef Grohe, Gauleiter of Cologne-Aachen, flees with his staff. After shooting 4 civilians for raising white flags in Heilbronn on April 6th, Kreisleiter Richard Draus gets back into his car and flees the city. On April 13th, Albert Hoffmann, Gauleiter of Westphalia South, announces the dissolution of the regional Nazi party and vanishes into thin air. On April 19th, the Kreisleiter of Schwäbisch Gmund orders 2 men executed for drunkenly shouting, "Drop dead, Hitler! Long live Stauffenberg! Long live freedom!" After the shots echo through the woods, the Kreisleiter and his men flee the town. The worst betrayals belong to the fortress Gauleiters in the east. Gauleiter Erich Koch has spent the war enriching himself and brutalizing the Polish and Jewish inhabitants of East Prussia. But after declaring that Festung Königsberg would be the grave of the Bolsheviks, Koch flees on April 23rd aboard an icebreaker, leaving 100,000 refugees stranded on the Samland. Arriving eventually in Flensburg, he then unsuccessfully demands a U-boat to take him to South America. In Festung Breslau, Karl Hanke has cannibalized his city into a fortress. For his efforts, he is awarded the German Order, the highest decoration of the Nazi Party, and praised as a hero by Albert Speer. But in the early hours of May 5th, this National Socialist hero climbs into his Fiesler Storch and leaves 200,000 people to their fate. Also making a break for it is none other than Ferdinand Schörner, the man who above all represents the army's slavish devotion to Hitler at the end of the war. Even after the Führer's death, Schörner continues to rule with the same iron fist. He gives his last orders to Army Group Center in Czechoslovakia on May 5th. With the war lost, his strategy is to hold off the Red Army and the Czech partisans, retreat westward and surrender to the Americans. Schörner sends out a warning to any man thinking of cutting and running. In these hard days, we must not lose our nerves or become cowardly. Any attempt to find your own way back to the homeland is a dishonorable betrayal of your comrades and of our people, and will be punished. Those punishments continue to be meted out for any and all infractions. On May 7th, Schörner watches on as his military police shoot 22 soldiers in Lednice for the crime of standing around without orders. But like so many other Nazi leaders, it is Schörner who reveals himself as a coward. On May 8, he flies away towards the American lines in Austria, leaving his men to their fate with the Soviets. That is the bravery of Nazism. Like many other extremists, when push comes to shove, it's only about them. Driven by egocentric delusions and the choice to discard reason and humanity for the cult of conspiracy myths and chauvinism, they will claim that the hatred they preach is the lesser evil to achieve the greater good. They will call themselves righteous, dance around the fires of rage, fan the flames, don war paint, cry battle, and demand that their tribe follows them into war. They will expect the ultimate sacrifice from their followers and celebrate death as a heroic choice. But when the battle luck sours, they will deflate and reveal that they are nothing but little scoundrels dressed in outsized uniforms. Then they will either try to run to save their own skin or escape the consequences of their actions by a coward's death. For they are the opposite of heroes, the antithesis of upstanding, and the contrary of righteous. Don't listen to the bullying, bloated screamers bloviating about how they are fighting for you. They will never fight for you, and when you fight for them, they will abandon you at the snap of a finger if it serves them better. Never forget.